Hello, this is Adam Bernard with AutoPerspectives, and it's normally time for a news roundup, but we're going to do things a little differently this week with this special edition focusing on Ford. Why Ford, you might ask? Well, Ford was in the news for quite a bit last week, and so I wanted to spend a little time here on the YouTube channel talking about what Ford announced and what it means. To give you a little background, Ford is in kind of a tough place at the moment. Like the rest of the auto industry, they're struggling with tariffs. They're struggling with understanding EV demand because they break out Ford Blue as and Model E as ICE and EV business units. Everyone knows how much money Ford is losing on EVs, and it is a lot of money. They took a gamble, as did many other automakers, and it's hitting them right in the pocketbooks. Ford is also facing unprecedented numbers of recalls, and they've been dealing with recall and the quality issue for several years now. Ford stock, as I'm recording this, is $11.28. In May of 2017, when Mark Fields was fired from Ford as CEO, in part because of the stock performance, the stock was at $11.08. So Jim Farley's got a lot of pressure. And so they held this event last week to discuss kind of the future of Ford, at least from an EV standpoint, and also from a manufacturing standpoint. It's what Jim Farley decided to introduce as a Model T moment, harkening back, of course, to the amazing Model T, which pretty much reinvented the auto industry. This announcement referenced a $5 billion investment, creating about 4,000 jobs. And this is all around a program that was launched 3 years ago, rather under the radar, at a skunk works in Long Beach, California. And Ford actually took an old graphic from the 20s about the universal car and updated with some contemporary imagery, and now refers to the universal vehicle. And that ties in to what they announced here, which is the Ford Universal EV platform. And the idea is that, like the original Model T, which you could get as a two-seater, as a pickup truck, as a delivery van, as a family vehicle, as a convertible, that this platform would be fairly flexible. And kind of lay the groundwork for a new series of affordable vehicles for buyers. Jim Farley acknowledges this is a program and it's a wager. He says nothing is guaranteed. This is a bet. There is some risk involved, which is probably good given all the uncertainty in the auto industry these days. The event was held at the Louisville, Kentucky plant. That plant currently builds the Ford Escape and the Lincoln Corsair. Those vehicles are expected to end production this year or next year in time for the launch of the first of the Ford Universal EVs. And that would leave the Bronco Sport as the entry-level Ford alongside the Maverick. So a little change there to the portfolio. Ford has been selling a lot of Escapes in the past, but the Bronco Sport has been rather holding its own. Let's get into the details around what this platform includes. It will launch in 2027, and that in itself is not news. We've been hearing about this affordable EV platform for over a year now, and it's been on everyone's radar for 2027. And it will launch with a 5-passenger, what they call a midsize pickup. Again, that's also not really news. We have heard that it is the footprint of a Maverick, but the interior space of a Ranger, which kind of makes sense because you're not accommodating an internal combustion powertrain. And the starting price is said to be $30,000. And of course, by the time this vehicle launches, there will be no sort of tax incentive. So it's a $30,000 MSRP. Up until now, I think a lot of folks in the media had been thinking that this was going to be a $25,000 vehicle, and that might have been $25,000 after a $7,500 tax incentive. We'll never know because it no longer exists. But now $30,000 is the price point. It's worth noting this is about the same price as a comparably equipped Slate truck. And you might recall the Slate is a single cab EV that's going to be built in Indiana starting at the end of 2026. That vehicle was originally advertised as being under $20,000. That was with the tax rebate. And so that means it will likely start in the $25,000 to $27,000 range. That base vehicle will not have an audio system. It will not have a touchscreen. It will have crank windows. Jim Farley made it clear that they are not relying on a stripped out vehicle to get the price to $30,000. So we expect this vehicle to be reasonably well equipped for the price. And in case you're wondering, this is not a Maverick replacement. Ford has said that the internal combustion Maverick, which is going to be nearing the end of its life cycle around 2027, will continue. So there may be a facelift or a next generation in the pipeline as well. There weren't a lot of numbers around the performance of this vehicle, but they did mention that 0 to 60 would be about as fast as a Mustang EcoBoost, which puts it in the 4.5 to 5 second range, which is pretty darn good for a $30,000 vehicle. They didn't talk about range and they didn't talk about charging, but they did talk about the batteries. These will use lower cost lithium iron phosphate, or LFP batteries. Ford will be the first automaker to build those in America. And you may have read that Chevrolet will be putting LFP batteries into the updated Chevy Bolt early next year. Those batteries will initially come from China before General Motors starts building them here in North America. One of the innovations under the skin is a zonal architecture. It's similar to what Tesla uses and what Rivian installed last year in the R1. Basically intended to add technological capability and flexibility, including Blue Cruise, which up to now has been available largely on Ford's upper end vehicles. And it takes about 3/4 of a mile and 22 pounds of wiring out of the vehicle. So you get a lot of simplicity and you get a lot of cost reduction and mass reduction. It will use Tesla style single piece aluminum giga castings, which Ford calls unit castings, but same basic idea to reduce the number of parts. And they did note that the structural battery will form the floor of the vehicle. Now, one of the innovations around the Model T was not just the vehicle and its affordability, but also the fact that it was built differently than the way most people were building cars back at the turn of the century. And that's when Ford brought the assembly line to life. And it wasn't a brand new idea, but it was something that Ford perfected. And now Ford is talking about the Ford Universal EV Production System, essentially going from a single assembly line to a 3-branch tree with 3 sub-assemblies moving simultaneously. So essentially the front, middle, and the rear end of the vehicles will be assembled alongside each other and then put together at the end of the line. This is intended to reduce what Ford calls twisting, reaching, and bending. If you've seen videos of people working on these assembly lines, sometimes you've got to really twist yourself to fit the instrument panel in through the door and whatever. Ford is trying to make these vehicles easier to build and also improve worker safety. So there were a lot of UAW folks at the event, and the intent was to promote that as well. They're targeting to reduce the assembly time of these vehicles 40% versus the current Escape and Corsair. That is a significant reduction because when you reduce assembly time, you also help reduce cost. So that's good. But they did say that some of that time will be reinvested into insourcing and automation to improve quality and cost, ultimately netting a 15% speed improvement. So 15% is good, especially if they're spending a little more time and money on the quality side, which, as we know at the moment, is a problem. A few other metrics that they tossed out: 20% fewer parts versus a typical vehicle, 25% fewer fasteners, and 40% fewer workstations dock to dock. So a lot of efforts to again, simplify the vehicle. And these days, simplicity is a watchword in the auto industry as people look at ways of taking things out of the vehicle that are not really needed. And that was one of the key principles behind Slate. That's why you can only buy Slate in one variation. They didn't talk about build combinations with this vehicle, but I suspect it will be somewhat limited, not as limited as Slate, but the intent again is to unfortunately limit the choice of the customer to make it simpler as it goes down the line, as it were. Now, I mentioned this was intended to be kind of a family of vehicles. The graphic here suggests that the family could include a 3-row SUV, a midsize pickup, a van of some sort. They even showed a van without a second row, so like a commercial van. And then what in the upper right looks like an actual 4-door hatchback. Bill Ford has hinted that at least in Europe, Ford is underrepresented in the car market. So we may see a car of some sort, like a Focus type vehicle, come back into the Ford showroom that happens to be electric. Remember that the handy thing about a car versus an SUV is that for a given footprint, you've got a lighter vehicle and a more aerodynamic vehicle, which translates to better performance and better range. So there is a potential advantage there, especially, even though the US market is kind of SUV crazy, there are some competitors that are still building cars out here. This does seem overall like a positive step forward, especially with the new zonal architecture and the innovations around the manufacturing process. They did, we touched a little here on complexity and mass reduction, and there's more to be said here. So there's definitely more of a story. I think the big thing that we missed was actually looking at the vehicle. It's hard to get really excited about a process unless you're, a process geek. The Tesla did create a lot of excitement about the Cybertruck by showing it 4 years before production, even though that wasn't the plan. The plan was showing it 2 years before production. We are now roughly 2 years before the launch of this universal EV platform. And given that it's not replacing existing vehicles within the Ford showroom, they probably didn't have a lot to lose by showing us at least a concept of what this low-cost, innovative electric pickup would look like. So, again, we have the Los Angeles Auto Show coming up in November. We have CES in January, Detroit in January as well. So they may have decided we're just going to wait a little to show us an actual product, but I don't think they want to wait too long if they want to keep the momentum on this going. And then finally, this does put some additional pressure on to key American-based brands and automakers, as it were. As I mentioned, there will be a new Chevy Bolt, the 2027 model, so it launches early next year. It will look very similar to the outgoing Bolt EUV, a couple of tweaks in the front and rear, a couple of tweaks inside, but it will get Ultium technology. So expectations are that range and charging speed and performance are all expected to see some improvements. Charging speed especially was a big, I think they were down about 50 kilowatts for the DC fast charging, which is very, very low for a modern electric vehicle. And that vehicle will be on sale before Ford's Universal EV. But again, that vehicle is also based on almost a 10-year-old platform. So GM has not formally announced any plans for a next generation Bolt, but this may kind of trigger them to do something. And then with Stellantis, the former CEO had promised a $25,000 Jeep EV in 2026. And that could have been after the tax credit. We don't know. He's not even there anymore. We actually haven't heard a lot about this, especially with the new CEO. So we don't even know if that program is still alive or not. Stellantis has been having trouble with the EVs they have in market right now, like the Charger. There are heavy discounts on the Wagoneer S, and of course the Ram 1500 Rev was delayed and possibly canceled. So they don't really, at the moment, it doesn't look like they may even have anything to compete with Ford's new universal EVs. So a lot that we heard last week, a lot of it kind of interesting, a few disappointments, and probably some open questions that need to be answered still. So one would hope that Ford is working on filling those gaps in between now and whenever in 2027 these vehicles will hit the streets. And that about wraps things up for this special edition of Auto Perspectives. This week is Monterey Car Week, so we expect to see some news there, and we'll be back next Monday with a look at that. If you like what you saw and heard, please subscribe and share, and come and visit us at autoperspectives.net to check out the blog. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next Monday. Bye-bye.